All right, we're ready for the book of Joshua. Now, the questions that are handed out were, or for if you didn't get those, they'll be available on the front pew. Those are for the book of Judges. I'll be teaching here next Wednesday night on Judges 1 and 2. So that's what our plan is. We have some ground to cover, so let's see if we can get through chapter 24. That's our goal. We hope to make the trains arrive on time when we come to the end of the class. Let's see if we can. A little introductory information is always helpful for studies of a book, and so let's review what the book is about and review some of the highlights of the introductory material. The book is written by Joshua. It bears his name. He is the author of the book, according to chapter 24 and in verse 26. His name was Hoshea, which means salvation. Moses changed that to Joshua, which means Jehovah is salvation. Now that's significant because of the message of the book, that God is the salvation. God is their Savior. God is the one who leads them into the conquest. He was Moses' minister or Moses' assistant. He led in the battle of against Amalek. He was one of the two spies who was positive, Joshua and Caleb, you remember. Tradition and Josephus say that he was 85 at the time of the conquest. We know his age at the time of his death, which was 110, which tells us something of the time period that we'll say more about in a moment. The theme, what's the theme of this book we've been studying? Well, it's the conquest and the dividing of Canaan. And so here are the 12 tribes as it was finally all settled out. And so it's the conquest of all of that region and then the dividing into the various tribes. That's what this book is all about. Now, to give you a perspective, to look at this map, that looks like a rather large plot of ground. Looking at the scale, this is 50 miles here. To give you a little comparison, if you remember when we started the book, this is the land of Palestine, or the promised land, where the 12 tribes settled. That's the size of it in comparison to the U.S. and to our own state. So it's a rather small region in comparison to, say, our own state of Tennessee. This is the first of the historical books of the Bible. We have the Pentateuch, which is the giving of the law books, the 5 law books, followed by a section. Remember, the Bible is organized by subject matter, and so we have a section of books we call history books that'll carry us all the way through Esther. When we get through Esther, we've covered all of Old Testament history. That's not to say there's not history before that, or there's not history in the prophets, but that's all of the history. We've covered all of the Old Testament history when we get to Malachi. This is the first one of those, and that is Joshua being the first, and Judges will be the second. That's not in true chronology, by the way, as you're going to obviously see. This is a continuation of the Pentateuch. It continues and proceeds with national history. While the Pentateuch was the giving of the law, it does also deal with history. There are 2 major points in the book, chapters 1 through 12, though we're going to divide it differently, and we did, in 3 sections. There are 2 major thoughts, the conquest of the land and the division of the land. And those are 2 different matters. Once the land was conquered, there's still the dividing of the land. There's much yet to be done, according to chapter 13 and in verse 1. Now, what about the time frame did it cover? I forget about some of the time frame after we get on deep into the book, and this is helpful to me to go back and refresh my memory, that it covers about 25 years. If he was 85, as tradition says, and 110 when he died, and we know that to be the case, that's about 25 years. So it carries us from the death of Moses to the death of Joshua. The first 12 chapters really cover 7 years approximately. Some say 5 to 7 years. I think 7 based on a passage we'll look at this evening. And then the rest of the 18 years, or 20 if you think it was 5 years, the other 18 years had to do with the settling of the tribes into their regions. Now, the outline of the book that we've looked at each time, you ought to be familiar with this. We followed Wiersbe's outline of 3 major points. There was the crossing of the river, and that was a major event. Then there is the conquering of the enemy, the conquering of the land, and then there is the claiming of the inheritance in chapters 13 to 17. So I encourage you to get a Bible, and let's start with chapter 1. And what we're going to do is we're going to take each chapter, get kind of a summary of that, because that's what we're trying to do, is just to review, summary of that chapter, and then we're going to list at least 1, sometimes 2 practical things that we learn from that chapter. In graded ages, that's what you're going to be looking for. So we're going to see where we are in the outline each time. And let me stop and footnote right here. If you don't have this at the beginning of the book of Joshua, this note, that God was driving out the nations because he was punishing those nations he drove out. You should have that note somewhere. That'll be helpful to you. And passages that would tell us that, Genesis 15:16, Leviticus 18:25-27, and Deuteronomy 9:4 and 5. Now I'll give those again before we leave this point. So if you didn't get that down, we're going to get that again. But here's the point. God didn't just say, well, you know what, I need a place for my people, and I think I'll just drive all these people out and just get them out, like you might tell your neighbor, I'm going to drive you out of your house because I'd like for my family member to live over there. That's not how it was done. God was punishing these nations for their sin, whether his people occupied the land or not. So that's how God fulfilled the promise, is he knew these nations were wicked and sinful, and he's punishing them and driving them out because of their sin. Again, the reference would be Genesis 15:16, Leviticus 18:25-27, so Genesis 15:16, Leviticus 18:25-27, and Deuteronomy 9, verses 4 and 5. All right, now let's start our run through the book. The first section is crossing the river, and let's start with the commission to Joshua. We're going to come back to this outline each time we change section. Here's chapter 1. Chapter 1 is Joshua prepares for the conquest. Moses has died, that's how the book opens, and Joshua dies is how the book ends. So Moses has died, and Joshua is chosen to succeed Moses in verses 1-9. God tells him, for example, at verse 6, to be strong and of good courage. You're going to have a need for strength and courage because I have a job for you like you're not going to believe. He gives him at verse 8 the key to success. And that is, let the word of God meditate upon it day and night, and observe and do all that is written, and then your way will have great success. If you're going to have success in this mission I'm giving you, you're going to have to take heed to the law, obey the law, and just do exactly what I tell you, and it's going to go. It's going to go well for you. That's what God tells the leader. Now, the rest of the chapter is where Joshua commissions the people to get ready. We're going to cross the Jordan in 3 days, so get everything ready. And Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh were to stay on the east. That is, the fighting men come across. But those tribes, their families stay on the other side, and the people respond by saying, we're going to do exactly what we need to do. Now, what do we learn from chapter 1? I learn about the importance of preparation. Any job you take. You want to be a teacher, you need to be prepared. Long before you ever start teaching, and then when you teach, you need to be prepared. You want to be an elder? You need to be preparing now, young fellas. You're not even married. You need to be preparing now to be an elder. So one day when you're married and have children and mature, then you're ready to be an elder. Anything you go to do, you want to teach your neighbor the gospel, then you need to be preparing. Anything worth doing is worth preparing for. And the key to success is another thing I learned, is simply to do what God tells you to do. Take heed to that. All right, now let's move to chapter 2. We're still crossing in that section of crossing. We ain't got to the river yet, but here's the covenant with Rahab in chapter 2. Now, what happens in chapter 2? Well, the spies were sent to Jericho. There were 2 spies that were sent to Jericho, and the spies went to the house of Rahab, who hid them. She's called Rahab the harlot. That doesn't mean she was a harlot at the time. She is a woman of faith, as we're going to see, as the chapter unfolds. Some think that they went because she was still a harlot and they were doing immoral things. There's no evidence of that at all. But nonetheless, Rahab states, I want you to notice this section in 8-10, that she knows God has given the land to them. So let's get a little bit of that flavor beginning at verse 8. She says, or verse 9, I know that the Lord has given the land, and the terror of you has fallen on us. And we are faint-hearted because of you. And we have heard how the Lord dried up the water. See, we've heard that. We've heard that story. It's got over to us. And what was done to the kings on the other side, I'm paraphrasing, to Sihon and Og. And notice that she says at verse 11, we heard these things, and our hearts melted. And then she goes on to say that your God, he is the God in heaven above and in the earth beneath. I know about your God. We've heard about your God. She indeed is a woman of faith. She let the spies down by scarlet cord to escape. And then the spies come running back to Joshua, and they say, we can take it. This is going to work. Now, what do I learn from, by the way, where they were camped out was at Abel Shittim. Right here is where they were camped out as they went over to Jericho to check that out. Now, what do we learn? Well, I learned several things, but one of the things I learned from chapter 2 is that we need faith like Rahab the harlot. She is listed in Faith's Hall of Fame in Hebrews chapter 11. And you look at this woman, she said, I've heard about this. I've heard about your God. And when I heard what he did for you and the power that he has, and our hearts melted when we heard about that. And he's obviously the God in heaven above and the earth beneath. He's ruler over everything. He's not like the gods we've heard about. Faith of Rahab the harlot. All right, let's go further. Let's take 2 chapters now. The crossing of the Jordan. These 2 chapters talk about getting across the river itself. So they're getting ready to go. Now chapter 3 has to do with crossing the Jordan itself. So let's turn to chapter 3, see what happens. What Joshua does in chapter 3 is command the people to follow the ark. He said the priests are going to bear the ark, and when they take off, you take off after them. Put some distance between you and the ark. That shows reverence for the things of God. And the reason you're going to follow the ark is because we've not passed this way before. We've never been this way before. You've never crossed through a river before. You've never gone and conquered enemies before. You've never gone into the land of giants before. You've never passed this way before. I want you to notice at verse 8. Or rather, verse 10. That Joshua said, he talked about when they were going to cross the Jordan, and by this, you might put a star by this verse, you'll know that the living God is among you and that he'll drive out your enemies. In other words, when you cross over the Jordan, we're going to say more about that in just a second. When you cross over the Jordan and see this water parted, you know that God did that, and you're going to know that when you get on the other side, God's going to work for you. We'll say more about that here in just a moment. Now, what they did at verse 10, starting at verse 14, when the priests put their foot into the river, it's overflowing at this time according to verse 15, then they put their foot in the river, the water begins to part and heaps up on one side. And so they walk across, not in muddy trenches, but they walk across on dry land. That could only be done by the power of God. So the people cross over. Now here's what I'm learning from this chapter. The power of God has just been demonstrated, and what that should mean to them is they should never question God in the future. You stop and think about what God had just demonstrated. That it also gave a pronouncement of approval of Joshua. Joshua said, you put your foot in the water, and the water's going to part, and that's exactly what happened. That ought to tell them, Joshua is a man of God, and you better listen to Joshua. But it also told them, God has the power. If he can part these waters, he can conquer your enemy. And so when God says, you're going to be able to take this enemy, you're going to be able to take the enemy. You can do it with a handful of people, you're going to do it with a handful of people, because he caused the waters to part. They forgot about that, though, as we're going to see a little bit later. So let's go to chapter 4. Chapter 4 deals with the memorial stones. Joshua had 12 men as they're crossing the river, according to verses 1 to 8, to pick out 12 stones and to take them with them. Now, what are they going to do with them? We're going to see that in a moment. But then Joshua set another 12 stones. That's a different altar, or different stones at verse 9, and set them in the middle of the river where it's dry. And then the priests cross on over. The priests are standing there with the ark. And as the people cross over, and as they've all gone across, the priests go on across. Beginning at verse 15, the water comes back and the land and the river begins to flood again. The Jordan River is overflowing as it was before. Then they take the stones where they go to camp when they get across and set them up as a memorial. So there's 2 sets of stones. And where were the others set up? Well, it was where they got and landed after they finished at before they get to Jericho, after they cross the river, they go to Gilgal. And that becomes home base for a little while. So now what did we just learn from chapter 4? Need to be reminded lest we forget. We need reminders. That's why we have the observance of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week, lest we forget. We need to be reminded of things that we think we know well and we think we'll never forget. We need reminders of that. Let me footnote to say, I never hear this much out of adults, but I hear this sometimes out of young people, like high school and below, when you say, well, we're going to study the book of Revelation in class. And somebody will be sure to say, well, I've already studied that. Yeah, we're going to study it again. Yeah, we're going to study it again. Because you know what? You need to be reminded of what you already know. And even though you've heard it and you know it, we're going to study it again. We're going to go over that again. And we're going to go over that again. You need to be reminded of things you already know. All right, now let's go to chapter 5. Chapter 5 is the last of this section of crossing the river. There's the circumcision at Gilgal. That's where they land, and that's where the camp is. So let's see what happens in chapter 5. The second generation. Now remember, the first generations died off in the wilderness, and that was the purpose for being in the wilderness for 40 years. They've all died off. This is the second generation. There were the kings of the Amorites and the Canaanites become fearful because they've come across the river now. As long as they're on the other side, no problem. They've just marched across the river. Remember, Rahab said, we've heard about what y'all are doing. And verses 2 to 9 says they circumcised all the males. Now what does that tell you? That tells you that while they were in the wilderness, they were not doing what Leviticus 17 had said. And that had not been practicing circumcising their children on the 8th day. So that's why they need to do that now, is because they have been failing to do what God had been telling them to do. They haven't been observing, for example, at verse 10, the Passover. Not since Sinai had they been observing that. No evidence of that. And so the manna also ceased, and they ate of the produce of the land, and the Lord appeared by an angel, apparently, to Joshua, and telling him to take off his sandals, for the place where he stands is holy, and Joshua did so. But the main thing I want you to see here, a couple of practical things from chapter 5. There was the neglect and the failure to obey. Even though they had come out and God had delivered them with a strong right hand out of Egypt, they still weren't obeying him like they should in the wilderness. And furthermore, I learned what a statement of faith and devotion since they couldn't fight. Now what I mean by that, without being graphic, they have just been circumcised. But they've just come into enemy territory. They're not going to be able to fight for a while. These are fighting men. And they're not going to be able to fight for a while. And the faith and the courage to do what God said, knowing they put themselves in a predicament of fighting until they heal up. And consequently, that's a statement of faith, because God said, you're going to conquer this land, and I'm going to be with you, but I want you to be circumcised first. That took a statement of faith and devotion to say, we'll do that because that's what God wants us to do. What a statement of faith that was. All right, now we got them across the river. And they're starting to catch up with reference to their obedience and being cleansed, and now they're ready to do the will of conquering the enemy. So let's talk about conquering the enemy, 6 through 12. Now within that section, we have the central campaign, southern and northern campaign, and the kings defeated. Let's talk about the central campaign. That'll take us from 6 through chapter 9. So go to chapter 6 with me, if you will. Chapter 6 is the taking of Jericho, one of the more memorable chapters of all the book. The Lord gave instructions for taking the city. God said, I have given into thy hand Jericho. It's a gift. But it's conditional now. And God said, march around the city once a day for 6 days. And on the 7th day, march around 7 times, blow the trumpets and shout. And then the walls will fall down flat. Not a typical way of conquering a city. Not how an army would take a city. And then the text goes on to tell us what was spared and what was done, and they'd be cursed if they'd rebuild. Now here's the point I want you to see, because this is going to be important when we get into the next. And one of the points I want you to see. They were forbidden to take of the cursed things. In other words, of the spoils. You can't take spoils for yourself. That's to be put into the treasury. So you can't rush in and take gold and silver and any of the spoils. You don't do that. You're going to go in, you're going to kill, and you're going to take the spoils and put it into the treasury of the Lord. That's what you're going to do. Well, what do we learn from chapter 6? God's way is different than man's. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, if I was going to take the city, and I was going to think through the best way to do that, I don't think marching around the city once a day for 6 days would be the way I would have dreamed of doing that. Why don't we see if we can just march around the city for, in fact, if 6 times for 6 days, or 7 days is good, why don't we march around for 10 days? It may fall down even further and be stronger. Let's really do this good. That doesn't make any sense from human reasoning. And there's going to be a number of things you come across in the New Testament that you're going to look and say, that doesn't make sense, that's the way to do that, because human reasoning makes more sense to do it this way. It may be discipline of your children, it may be church discipline, it may be teaching someone the gospel, whatever it may be. Man's way is different than God's way, and God's way obviously works. Now what happens in chapter 7? There was the defeated Ai and Achan's sin. What happened at Ai? Well, Achan took of the accursed things. There was a man there named Achan. He went and took something. We don't know what all he took till later in the chapter, but he took of the accursed thing. And then they make their attempt to fight Ai. Remember the spies who went there and they said, they recommended, let's just go with 3,000 men because we can take this city. And they lost 36 men according to verse 5. And 3,000 were put to flight, and they ran, and they lost 36 men in the process. Joshua is upset and cries out to the Lord, what's going on? Why did you lead us out here to defeat us? So they were defeated. The Lord tells Joshua, beginning at verse 10, here's the problem. The problem is their sin. Look at verse 13. He said, you cannot stand before your enemies, I'm at the end of the verse, until you take away the accursed thing from among you. So they finally figure out it's Achan. Look at verse 21. When he's pinned down about this, he said, I saw among the spoils a Babylonian garment and silver and gold, and I coveted and I took, and there they are hidden. I saw it, I liked it, I acted upon it, and I then tried to hide my sin. That's the whole nature and the process of sin described in one verse. Now, what did I learn from chapter 7? The impact of one person's sin. One person can destroy much good. One person can undo a lot of good in this church. You say, well, that's just one person. I'm one person. But you and your sin, or me and my sin, can undo a lot of good. Tremendous amount of good. This is the opposite of what we saw in chapter 6. We're all working together, obeying God. They did well. The impact of one person's sin seen in chapter 7. Let's go to chapter 8 now. This is the victory now at Ai. What's the difference? Well, the Lord gives them instructions for victory. And so let's see what that says in verses 1 and 2. So don't be afraid or dismayed. I have given into your hand. Verse 2, you shall do to Ai as you did to Jericho. Only its spoils and cattle you shall take as booty. In other words, you can take that this time, and if Achan had just waited, he wouldn't have died, and he could have had some spoils. If you just wait, do it according to God's way, it may be better. On a number of things. So now, beginning at verse 3, we have the story of the ambush and how the ambush was set up. We won't go through all the descriptions of that. But the men of Ai pursued Israel into the wilderness, and then Ai was burned. In other words, he set up two groups of people. So that some led them out of the city, and those that were left behind hiding in ambush, they came in and burned the city. And as those who had fled turned back, then they're caught in the middle and they're killed, and so they conquered Ai. And so now they have victory. How did they have victory? Because they had taken care of the sin and decided to do things God's way. What did I learn from chapter 8? The way to succeed is God's way. If what I'm doing is not working, then maybe I could try God's way. In other words, maybe I'm raising my kids and I'm not disciplining them and I'm having trouble with my children and it looks like things are not going well. Maybe I just try God's way. And that might work. That just might work. I've been trying to bring people back to the Lord, but I've been doing it on my own way because I think God's way is too harsh. Maybe I ought to try God's way. God's way works. It did in chapter 8. Let's go to chapter 9. This is the last of that subsection. And here we have the treaty with the Gibeonites. This is where men of Gibeon deceived. They were only 20 miles away. But they had on old worn out clothes and they brought molded bread and they talked about how they'd been on this long journey. Remember how they put on this picture of we're just parched and we're weary of this journey and look at this bread. It was fresh when we left home and it's moldy and it's crusty and clothes are worn out and everything. So what they did was deceive. And we need a treaty with you. And Joshua and the people gave their word. We'll make a treaty with you. And then they realized they'd been deceived. But Joshua said, we've given our word. And so Joshua made them woodcutters and water carriers. These men were from Gibeon. And so you see Gibeon in the circle right there. Ai is just above that right there. This is where the battles have been going. They said they were from a far country, long away. They were from Gibeon, 20 miles away. Here's what I learned from chapter 9. Very practical. It's easy to be deceived and misled. Don't believe everything someone tells you. It's easy to be misled and people feed you a line. It may be their side of the story of something that's been done. Or it may be a doctrine they're teaching you. It's very easy to be misled and to be deceived. But I want you to notice also in chapter 9, the text tells us at verse 14, they did not ask counsel of the Lord. I'm learning something about the danger of not seeking the counsel of the Lord. When you decide I'm going to get married, but you don't seek the counsel of the Lord, what the Lord wants about that marriage, are you going to raise your children? Are you going to teach your neighbor? Or just go on with the list of responsibilities and you don't seek the counsel of the Lord? Maybe in trouble. Maybe in big, big trouble they were. All right, we're still conquering the enemy. That was the central campaign. Now we have the southern campaign. That's in chapter 10. Now here's what happens in the conquest of the south. What you have in chapter 10 is you have 5 Amorite kings fought against Gibeon because they're fighting with Israel and with Israel. And Israel gained victory over those kings, the text tells us. But I want you to notice 2 things. Two or three things. Look at verse 8. The Lord said to Joshua, do not fear, for I've delivered them into your hand. There's no reason for you to fear. It doesn't matter if there are 5 kings coming against you. I'm going to deliver them. Now, God did a couple of things in this context. If you don't have it underlined or marked, verse 11, God caused large hailstones to aid in the battle. And God also caused this at verse 13, the sun to stand still. We talked about how that could be and what that might mean in our study, so we won't go back through that. But God used those things as tools to aid his people. So 5 kings were killed, and so there's the victory of the south was completed over the 7 other kings in addition to those 5. And so that was the conquest of the south. So here's how the campaign went. First, they move into the central section, and basically, though the text never says that was the purpose, the strategy seems to be to cut the nations off right through the middle, so that the children of Israel occupy the middle land and have a dividing line between the north and the south, so that the south cannot use any benefit of the aid of the kings of the north. So then they moved to the south and conquered it, and then they moved to the north, and that was the way that was done. Or another way of looking at that on a map, this is the land of Palestine. They had already conquered 2 kings on the east side. Then there is the central campaign, then there was the southern campaign, and then the northern campaign, and now the land is occupied when we get through with chapter 11, which we're about to come to. Now, what did I just learn from chapter 10? There were great accomplishments, but they're only by the power of God. They conquered 5 kings and then 7 more. That's great accomplishment. That seems greater and more significant than conquering like Ai or Jericho. 5 kings and 7 more. How did they do that? Only by the power of God. You can accomplish great things. Maybe you have accomplished great things. It's by the power of God. Now let's go to chapter 11. It deals with the northern campaign, and this is finally the conquering of the land when we get through with chapter 11. So here's the conquest of the north. The northern kings came to battle with Israel. Israel has victory over all the northern kings. They're listed and they're enumerated. But I want you to notice the land that Joshua conquered is listed here, beginning at verse 16 to verse 23. And so what we have in chapter 11, verse 15, we see a description of this careful obedience that Joshua performed. But then I want you to drop down with me to verse 20. I know we're hitting some high points and not hitting everything. We don't have time for that. But verse 20, that it was of the Lord to harden their hearts. This is, in other words, God working again, causing the victory to come about. The Lord had his hand and his mission intact. So what did I learn from chapter 11? There's no reason to fear when you're obeying God. God said, don't fear these kings. It doesn't matter how many there are. I've given them into your hand. You're going to be completing and you're going to conquer them. Now let's finish that section by looking quickly at chapter 12. We're not going to spend much time there because it deals with the defeated kings. It's basically a list of the kings. It lists, here's the kings that were conquered by Moses. So those are pretty quick to notice because there are basically 2, Sihon and Og. They were on the east side. But then, here's the kings that are listed by name. Here's who in the cities where they were from, in the central campaign, in the southern campaign, and in the northern campaign. So the conquest is over now. So what did I learn from chapter 12? And you get through reading chapter 12 and it's like reading a phone book. What benefit is that? Well, that gives confirmation in the details and the names and the places. This is not like a fairy tale of once upon a time in a far, far away land, Moses led and conquered some kings. And then Joshua led and conquered a bunch of kings too. Well, what kings? Where? I'm not sure if that's true or not. But the confirmation of that is given in the details of this is where it was. Here's the king in this city and this king in this city and this king and this king. And you say, I don't even know where that city is. Doesn't matter. It gives confirmation in the details. And that's the value of chapter 12. All right. Now, we're ready for the third and final section now of the book. And that is 13 to 24. We have crossing the river, conquering the enemy, and now we have the claiming of the inheritance. So we may think that once the land's been conquered, the work's done. We're just getting started. Because it took 7 years to do this. We're at about the 7-year point now when we come to the end of chapter 12. About 7 years into this, and we'll see more about that perhaps here in a moment. Now, within this section, there are 4 sections. So let's start with the first. The tribal territories are assigned. This is where they assign where Judah's going to be and where Manasseh's going to be and Gad, etc. So there were those on the eastern and those on the western side. So let's work through this. Chapter 13. We're going to go through these rather quickly because I want to get back to 22, 23, and 24 to wind this up. I want you to notice at verse 1. This is interesting because Joshua now is old. He's somewhere 90 to 100 years old according to Kyle and Delitzsch. And very advanced in years. And God said there remains much land yet to be possessed. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, you may have a marginal note. If you weren't here for chapter 13, might be a good time to make a marginal note. What verse 1 is talking about is not there's more land to conquer. You've conquered in the middle, central campaign, southern and northern campaign. We're going to conquer more land. The land's already been conquered. So what does it mean in verse 1? There's still work to be done as a tribe is assigned to a territory. For example, Judah, they get their territory. There are still pockets of the enemy or pockets of the nations still there that need to be driven out. And that's the very thing they failed to do. And we're going to see more about that. So what's chapter 13 about? Chapter 13 deals with the division of the land, which, by the way, was done by casting lots. And you'll remember from Proverbs 16 in verse 33, God's involved in that. God is the one who does the deciding. So there's land yet to be conquered, but then the land was divided on the east side. There were 2.5 tribes on that side, Reuben, Gad, and a half a tribe of Manasseh. They had asked if they could stay on the other side, and it was under the condition that Moses said, your fighting men are going to go across and fight, and then you can come back. And that's what they did. We're going to see that about chapter 22. What I learned from chapter 13, there's work yet to be done. It's not time to quit. There's work to be done. It's not time to quit. When you're baptized and you come out of the waters of baptism, that's like conquering the land. You're just getting started. It's not time to quit. There's work to be done. You get married and you say, well, we've got a great marriage. You're just getting started. You got kids to raise yet. And you get your kids up and you got them in school and you say, well, I've trained them and molded them. You're just getting started. There's yet work to be done. And so always remember there's work yet to be done. It's not time to quit. There's never a time to quit. Some of the greatest work accomplished by some of the people of God has been in their older years. Joshua was 85 when he started. I've given this illustration time and again. You think quite often that when we get old, in our senior years, it's time to sit back and let the younger ones, let them take over, let them do the work. Now, I've put my time in. You know, Homer Haley wrote, most of you probably got some writing of Homer Haley in your library. That everything he wrote after the age of 60. I don't think he wrote the first book before he's 60. And there's a whole passel of books and commentaries out there. Wrote them after he's 60. That's my age. He's just getting started when he's my age. So I'm a youngster getting started. There's much work yet to be done. All right, let's go to chapter 14 now. There's the division of the land on the west. So what we have is the land that is to be divided among 9.5 tribes. That was surveyed out. But I want you to notice about Hebron being given to Caleb. Now this in chapter 14 is interesting because Caleb, as you recall in chapter 14, was, by the way, this is where, if you don't have this in your notes, about verse 10, it's been 45 years since Kadesh. That is when the spies were sent out. He tells us that in these verses 6 to 11. There were 38 years in the wilderness wanderings, because it had been 2 years by the time they started the wilderness wanderings. So that means the 7 years. That's how we ended up with 7 years of conquest. That's how we know it was 7 years. We learned that from this chapter right here. But what I want you to notice is that when he asked for his territory, he asked for Hebron in the mountains where the Anakim were. What's the Anakim? It's a race of giants. Here's a man that's 85 years old. He said he was 40 years old when it started, and it's been 45 years, so he's 85 years old. He's 85 years old, and he said, tell you what, the territory I want is in the mountains where the giants have to be conquered. He's ready for a challenge. Instead of saying, I want that easy land down here. I'm old. I'm getting 85. I'm ready to be there. Not at all. Not with Caleb. All right, what did I learn from chapter 13? God blesses those who wholly follow him. Notice the phrases several times at verse 8, who wholly followed the Lord. Verse 9, who wholly followed the Lord. And again at verse 14, 3 times. Caleb is described as a man who didn't follow the Lord. He wholly followed, completely followed the Lord. The Lord blesses those who wholly follow him. All right, let's go to chapter 15. Now 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19, we're not going to have any practical lesson until we get to the end of that. Or it's going to be the same practical lesson when we get finally to the end. So if you keep watching for that, graded ages, it's going to be till we get to 19. So what do we have in chapter 15? Basically, this is the land that's going to be given to Judah. This is the land that's given to Judah. And so it gives us the description. So we're not going to go through all of that. What's chapter 16 about? It's the land that's given to Ephraim. And the description and the size and the borders, etc. All right? What do we have in 17? The land given to Manasseh, the other half a tribe of Manasseh. What do we have in 18? The land given to Benjamin. So we're dividing up the lands on the west side. And they surveyed again by casting lots. We've already talked about casting lots. Well, then chapter 19 catches us up because there's still quite a bit of tribes. There's the land given to Simeon and Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, Dan, and then Joshua gets his settlement, his city that he gets, where, by the way, is where he ends up being buried, verses 49 to 51. Now, what did I learn from all that? Now, this is the same thing. You might just mark all 15 to 19 graded ages, and there's one practical lesson you learn from all of that. That God blesses everyone among his people. In other words, he didn't just bless Judah. And sorry, Zebulun, you're not going to get anything. But Zebulun got their land too. And so did Issachar, and so did Reuben, and so did Gad, and so did Simeon. And God blessed everyone among his people. If you're among the people of God, you're going to be blessed. All right, now let's go to 20 and 21. What do we have in 20 and 21? Special cities. So now what's happened so far? This is taking some years to do this because 7 years to conquest and about 18 more years to do finally by the time we get to the end of the book. So what's happened so far? The land has been conquered, then the land is divided up into who gets what section, where the tribe is going to be, and still the work hadn't been done because of completely conquering the land in the sense of driving the enemies out. Because they don't do that. They don't do that. They don't fully drive out the enemies. There's several references even in this book, but we see it more as we go a little bit further. So let's go to chapter 20 now. What happens in chapter 20? This has to do with the cities of refuge. The cities of refuge. What was the purpose of the cities of refuge? Well, if a man was a murderer, he was to be punished and killed. But a man might accidentally kill someone and an avenger be after him, so he could run to one of the 6 cities God had designated as refuge, and there he'd be protected. And and then the cities are listed there, by the way. We'll come back to the practical thing. Let's look at the cities first. Here were the cities. Notice how they're spaced out so that a person in this territory had a city to go to, and a person in the north had a city to go to. They weren't all bunched up in one place. So God appointed 6 cities for that, 3 on one side of the river and 3 on the other side. Now, what did I learn from chapter 20? Motive makes a difference. Motive makes all the difference in the world. You can kill someone, as in this case, and it be an accident, and that's not the same as what we would call first-degree murder, intentional. He thought about it ahead of time and he intended to kill it. His motive had everything to do with whether he should live. That stands true even in our own day and time. Motive makes a difference. Let's go to chapter 21. Here's another special city, and that is the cities of the Levites. Now, the Levites did not get an inheritance in the sense that they got a territory. They got a large territory from this river to this city, etc. They didn't get that. But they have cities scattered out because they are servants of the house of God. And so they were given cities, and a number of cities they were given. And then we see at the end of the chapter that the land promise was fulfilled. So if you haven't marked this, turn on over to chapter 21. If you happen to miss that week, you might underline, we'll talk about those cities in just a moment, coming back to that, but you might underline at verse 43 that God had given all the land. God fulfilled his promise. Every bit of the land that God promised they got. In other words, wouldn't it be amazing if God gave them 80% of what he promised? I mean, I did pretty good, but I didn't give them everything, but God gave them every inch of the land he promised to give them. But what about these cities now? Well, here are the cities based upon the descendants of Levi. And we won't go over all those cities. We did that. But you see the number of the cities of the Levites, that was their inheritance, and they were given cities within the tribes. All right? So what do I learn from chapter 21 now? Chapter 21, concerning the land being fulfilled, God did all he promised, which means he'll do everything he promised to you. Whatever he's promised to you, he'll do. So how do I know? Because God gave every inch of the land to the people that he promised it to. All right? Let's go to chapter 22. Looks like we may have the train arriving on time here. All right. Chapter 22. The border tribes allotted, as Wiersbe calls it. What does that mean? He's talking about the tribes, the eastern tribes return and they build an altar. That is, now the fighting is over. The land has been settled out. So the fighting men over here from Reuben, Gad, and half tribe of Manasseh on the east side, they've been over on the west side fighting for the last 18 years. So now they go back across. You go back home now. You can go back home. The fighting's over. The conquering has been done. The settling out of the tribes have been done. So go back. And they do. But I want you to notice in chapter 22, they build an altar. In fact, it's described as a great and impressive altar at verse 10. The other tribes saw that altar. And they got all excited and thought that they are trying to set up an altar besides the altar of God. And they're trying to set up some idol or worship another God or a different place to worship God contrary to God. And they're ready to go to war with them. And come to find out they just misunderstood what was going on. Because these tribes said, no, this wasn't setting up another altar. We're not trying to set up another God. We're not trying to worship another God. This is a witness. This is testimony that we can come back across and worship, and there's unity of the tribes on each side of the river. That's what it's all about. In fact, this is a replica, verse 28, of the altars, what this is. And when they explained that, that pleased all the tribes, and there's unity then among the tribes. So here's what I learned from chapter 22. Actions are often misunderstood. In fact, well-intended action that was intended for unity. This is interesting. This was an action. We're going to put this altar here so that everyone knows that we can come back across and worship God, and that the tribes over here are united with the tribes over there. It was an action that was intended for unity and for good was misunderstood. So don't be surprised if your actions that you intend for good, somebody thinks you're intending harm by that. That may or well may happen. And I learned from this chapter, it's better to get the correct information before you go to battle. Before you're ready to battle and choose somebody out over something, might get the correct information because you might have misunderstood. And that was the case here. All right. Chapter 23 and 24, the entire nation admonished just before Joshua dies. Chapter 23, what happens? This is Joshua's farewell to the leaders. So Joshua calls all the leaders together. And basically what he tells them in this speech in chapter 23 is God has richly blessed you with the land. God gave you all the land and he's blessed you. But here's what's going to happen. God will drive out your enemies. Now you conquered the land, that's right. And you've been given the land, that's true. But there's still pockets of the Canaanites in the land. And you're going to have to drive them out. And God will do that. If, big if, you obey. You do what he says and he'll be with you. So when you get ready to drive them out, it doesn't matter if they're Anakin, if they're giants. Doesn't matter. You can drive them out. Doesn't matter how many there are. You can drive them out. It's if you obey him. So what I learned from chapter 23, if you obey God, you will defeat your enemies. He will defeat your enemies. If you obey God, you will be able, by the help of God, to defeat your enemies. That's Satan. You'll be able to defeat him. And I learn again from chapter 23 at verse 14 that not one word of the promise has failed. God said, I'm going to give them the land. God gave them the land. All right. One chapter and we're done. Chapter 24 will quickly hit because that ought to be fresh on our mind. That was last week. Joshua's farewell to all the people. And what does he say here? He reviews their history about how God had blessed them richly. And he gives them a challenge. This basically is what the chapter is all about, verses 14 and 15. To fear God and serve him in sincerity and in truth. Put away the gods. Some of them had already turned to idolatry. Put away the gods and serve the Lord, and choose you this day whom you'll serve. Whether the gods on the other side or whether the one true God. But as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. And that's basically what the chapter is about. It ends telling us that Joshua died at 110. So what I learned from chapter 24, we have a choice to make about serving God. What a way to end this great book. What a way to end this great book. All right, we'll stop there.